Please be seated. Well, the day after last Christmas, Portland lost one of its quirkier residents. I know you scoff. I love the Pacific Northwest, even lived out there for a bit, but let's face it, a lot of Portlandia is quirky in some very predictable ways. I saw way more originality in my pilgrimage to Stax. Portland never produced a Rufus Thomas, right? In his knee-high go-go boots, hot pink shorts, and cape, but I digress. Frances Gabe really was one of a kind and a bit of a phenom back in her day. Frances Gabe, you see, received U.S. patent number 4,428,085 for designing the world's first self-cleaning house. She eventually built it with her own hands. She finished construction in 1984 and lived in the house into her 94th year. It was made of concrete, cinder blocks. There was a button on the wall in each room that Mrs. Gabe, under the protection of a rain slicker and an umbrella, would push to start the cycle. Soapy water from sprinklers would coat the walls and the floor, followed by a rinse, and then the room was all blown dry with warm air. Now, as you can imagine, certain accommodations were necessary since Frances Gabe was essentially living in a car wash. Her furniture was encased in clear acrylic resin, upholstered in heavy naugahyde fabric that she also invented. She designed an awning to pull over the bed to keep it dry on wash day. Artwork was coated in plastic. Books had been wrapped in what I guess you'd have to call water jackets, since dust was the least worry of books in this house. She was wise enough to cover up the electrical outlets, too. You can talk all you want about women's liberation, Ms. Gabe told the Baltimore Sun in 1981, but houses are still designed so women have to spend half their time on their knees or hanging their head in a hole. She was 101 when she died. Frances was right that labor-saving devices didn't exactly liberate women from their homes as promised. But maybe it's just me. Living in her self-cleaning house didn't exactly sound like liberation either. As wonderful as the idea of a self-cleaning house sounds, living with everything around you sealed up, impermeable, watertight, free of contamination, and impervious to spills, it sounds a little less than inviting. Life like that seems to be sealed off from the comforts of ordinary contact with the world, soiled and imperfect as it is. Now, there are Christian versions of the allure of the self-cleaning house. They all begin with the notion that God demands a clean interior house on our part before God will have anything to do with us. Unless it involves smiting, we are worthy of smiting, but not much else in these religious systems. One old method of cleaning ourselves up involved a priest. It insisted that God gave these special powers of absolution to people who kind of dressed like me. Come to confession for your weekly soul cleaning, and then go ahead and then you can commune with God. There's a Protestant version of that too, though. Martin Luther said the Christian is like a dunghill covered with a dusting of snow. The snow is Jesus' doing, by the way. So when God sees us, God sees the pretty white snow, not the dung. It's nice, right? We gave up the burden of indulgences so we'd be free to see ourselves as piles of never mind. But the underlying assumption is the same. God cannot abide us as we are. We've got to get cleaned up or covered up before we can come into contact with the holy. And while there are some moments in Scripture that do seem to affirm this view of things, there are so many more stories that blow it right out of the Bible's not-so-sudsy water. Take the story of Jacob. Remember him? He's not a minor character. God is often referred to not by God's name or characteristics, but as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob is the one who, after a famous wrestling match, will have his name changed, not to Craig or Larry or Steve, but to Israel. When Israel tells the story of Jacob, Israel is telling the story of itself. And that's incredible. Because the story of Jacob's family is filled with reality TV levels of dysfunction. For one thing, Jacob's a reminder to all of us that if you've got a patriarch for a daddy, you can get away with a lot more shenanigans this life than the rest of us. Some things haven't changed at all in the past few thousand years. His mother, Rebecca, is a case study on the damage overparenting can do, especially when you've got a favorite. After Jacob scams his brother Esau out of his birthright, it's Rebecca who helps him trick old, nearly blind Isaac by putting an animal pelt on his arm so he'll feel like his hairier brother. Sharp as attack Isaac blesses the wrong son. And since intent is apparently 0% of ancient Hebrew law, the blessing stays with Jacob. This is all in the Bible, folks. These are just a few colorful highlights from the lead up to today's reading, where Jacob's on the lam because, I forgot to mention there's also this sibling rivalry in the story that's about to get deadly. Esau wants to kill his brother for all that trickery, so Jacob gets out of town. Now here's a guy who's ready to do some real damage in the world, don't you think? He's the entitled son of a powerful father who's gotten where he is by graft and scheming, helped along by a conniving mother, and now he's running for his life, probably scared half to death. He's a ticking bomb, I'd say, when he lays his head on a stone out in the desert, goes to sleep, and dreams an unspeakably beautiful dream. Bible scholars will kind of ruin all those gospel songs and string weaving games we learned as children when they tell us Jacob's ladder was actually more of a ramp, or maybe these tiered terraces called a ziggurat, whatever it was. It led to an opening in the heavens. Angels moved between this realm and the home of God. And Jacob, our trickster Jacob, who could use a self-cleaning soul like nobody's business, Jacob's told that all the families of the earth shall be blessed by his offspring. That's the message he receives. It is this spectacularly dysfunctional family that God will make a source of blessedness for all the families of the earth. Jacob wakes up, rubs the sleep out of his eyes, and said, God was in this very place, and I didn't know it. This is none other than the house of God, the gate of heaven. How about that? God doesn't seem to demand that our souls or our stories be squeaky clean before God arrives. Jacob sure wasn't. But how then does this Christian life work? How are we meant to live if God is as likely to show up and bless the Jacobs of this world as anyone else? Are we supposed to behave badly to be blessed? Well, I don't think that's quite the point of the story. But the story does pretty thoroughly disrupt that idea that blessedness comes only to the good and curses land on the not so good. And there may be a blessing in this disruption. I gave you a couple of unfair and oversimplified caricatures of the Catholic and Protestant systems for cleaning up the soul, both of which seem to be premised on the idea that God just can't abide uncleanliness. But clearly God can, and clearly God does. And when we see that the soul work we do has nothing to do with making ourselves worthy, everything changes. Everything. Brené Brown is a psychologist and a researcher who studied the effects of shame and guilt on people. She says that they're really not the same thing at all. Guilt is the knowledge that I've done something wrong. Shame is the feeling that something's wrong with who I am. Guilt I can go do something about. I can say I'm sorry. I can try out a different response next time. Count to 10. Give back the money, whatever. But shame, as was the case from the first moments after the fall earlier in Genesis, shame is that impulse to cover myself up. Shame puts distance between people, and distance between people and God. Because if I think not that I've made a mistake, but that I'm unclean and unworthy at my core, I'm not going to let you in to see it. And I'll try to keep God out as well if I can, even though God's still wandering the garden, calling our names, inviting us to walk in the cool of the evening. And what all this means is that even the good works I try to do in the world can be a problem when they arise from my shame rather than guilt. If shame drives my actions, my good works don't express who I am. They become one more way to hide from you who I am. They're just more fig leaves and distractions and barriers between who I really am and the world. I'll do all these good things so you won't notice the damaged goods deeper down. I'll do all these good things. Maybe God will bless me. Maybe God will overlook the damaged goods deeper down. Such is the alienation that sin brings to our lives. It's what we read back at the beginning of Genesis. Shame's not a corrective for sin. Shame's what sin looks like as it pushes us further and further and further apart. So what has any of this to do with Jacob and Esau and Rebekah and Isaac later on in Genesis? Well, every time Christians and Jews slip into self-cleaning house theology, we only have to go back to these defining moments of our common story where we find God coming to Jacob, so conspicuously unworthy by measures of worthiness. We find God coming to Jacob and saying, "Here I am. I've dropped a ladder right down into the disheveled ethical mess that's your life. And I'm going to bless all the families of the earth through none other than you. And maybe in doing so, shame will lose its hold even on some poor soul many generations from now. Maybe when they see I can bless the world through the likes of you, others will stop the cleanup games and the cover-ups and come to me just as they are." Frances Gabe was 101 when she died. We're told that for all her cleverness and cleanliness, she actually had a really hard time living with other people. Some say it was the concrete mixer that stood in her yard for decades that put the neighbors out. Maybe it was the surly Great Danes she kept, or maybe it was her habit of doing yard work in the nude. We'll never know. But what I can't help wonder is whether the waterproofing and sealing off of every precious thing in your life to withstand the relentless scrubbing of a self-cleaning house seals a person off from a lot more than grime. Something like that's happened to me a time or two in this life. So I hope Frances found happiness in ways that the New York Times didn't know about. I hope at least one person loved her deeply, whether her house was spotless or not. Maybe what I hope most of all is that if building a self-cleaning house really was as suffocating and lonely as it seems, maybe one day Frances woke to the barking of those obnoxious Great Danes and saw a ladder had dropped down from the edge of heaven to her porch. I hope she heard the voice of God say, "My dear, miserable Frances Gabe, I'm going to bless all kinds of people in this world through none other than you." Stranger things have happened, Frances Gabe. Read the book. Stranger things have happened.